Bonjour. Hello, everyone. Welcome back in this huge room. Yeah. How was the storytelling sessions? Did you enjoy it? Ah, come on. How were they? Yes? It is really impressive because the conversation is happening everywhere. You know, I just went to the toilet, and you should hear the conversation there. Deep, strategic conversation, and it's happening everywhere. And for this part of the day, I have the privilege to share the stage with another MC, a friend, a colleague, and a CED practitioner. We enter in that movement in the social enterprise stream, but really we open our heart to a broader perspective. And it's Andy Orsnell from the Center for Local Prosperity. And I think as a co-host of this conference, it would be great to know more about you, but also the center.
Sure, yeah. So I work I wear a number of hats, and one of the hats I wear is a consultant with the Center for Local Prosperity. We're a society based in Nova Scotia, really do work throughout the Maritimes around localization and the power of building thriving local economies. We do that through doing research. So we did import replacement study, which some of you attended our session. We run an event called Local Prosperity, which is a conference that showcases grassroots efforts to develop thriving local economies, and just generally share stories about what's working in local communities. So it's a great organization. We have a small crew of kind of people in a staff role, but we've got an excellent board of 12 people from all over, mostly Nova Scotia, but not entirely. Kind of the usual suspects you would expect to see. But we have an extended network of advisors of about 24 from international folks.
And I want to thank you because we're far away, Ontario and Nova Scotia, but at the same time, I feel so close when I'm following you in social media. You have a way to tell the story in an ongoing process, ongoing process. You're telling what's going on, you're sharing the experience during the event, but also the lessons learned. And from Ontario, when I'm reading that, looking at the picture and everything, I learn quite a lot in the process you're going through.
Well, that's great. So I've got a quick quiz for you.
Oh.
So can you tell me what the theme of this conference is?
I think I said it many times. And you know what? People who knows me at CCEDNet, I think the first thing I learned to say in English was connecting the dots. And many people who knows me heard me saying that for many years. But the theme is really people's planet and economy. But the fascinating thing is to connect all of those elements to really have impact. But let's remember, we talk a lot about values and principles, we're sharing practice and stories, but people's planet and economy, we can't work in silos anymore, and they are really interconnected.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say for really a long time, I'll put my social enterprise hat on, that we tend to kind of have a focus on
business.
Business or social justice or environmental issues, and we're just now starting to kind of knit those things together. So we actually start addressing all three, and more importantly, seeing that they have to be you can't get one without the other. And I think it was in Naomi Klein's book, "This Changes Everything," perhaps, where she said you can't deal with climate change if you don't deal with economic inequality and inequality generally and social justice. So we have to deal with those things as a unit. And so that's why it's really exciting in this conference. It's the first time where we've had an environmental organization as the host, so the New Brunswick Environmental Network. So you met Raissa last night. And I can tell you, sitting on the planning committee, it was really wonderful to see that we were very consciously in the design of the conference trying to knit these things together and see them as mutually reinforcing. And so this plenary is a really obvious manifestation of this thinking. We're bringing together those various aspects into one discussion, and that address them as supporting themes, not separate themes. So we're fortunate to have two excellent speakers. We've got Dale Prest from Community Forest International, and just stepping into the breach because our other speaker is sick with the flu. We have, but no less of a great speaker, Wendy Keats from the Co-operative Enterprise Council of New Brunswick. So big hand of applause for
And we'll welcome you on stage.
Wendy just found out 5 minutes ago she was doing this, so come on up.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm Raissa Marks. You met me last night, and I'm going to be, trying to lead these two cats through this discussion. So we'll see how it goes. So Dale Prest, Chief Executive Officer of Climate Forest Company, a new startup, and Wendy Keats, Executive Director of the Co-operative Enterprise Council of New Brunswick. So we'll just start it off. So we know there's climate change, biodiversity loss, all kinds of ecological disastery type things going on. So we really have an imperative to integrate that kind of analysis and that thinking into all aspects of our society. So I'm wondering, maybe Wendy, we'll start with you. How do we move towards this, or have you seen examples of where this is really happening?
Is this on? No. I think that where I see the examples happening are actually very much at the grassroots level. And there's been a growing interest. So for folks that don't know me, I've lived off the grid for the last 14 years. And, back then, when you went off the grid, you were an old hippie, basically.
And what are you now?
Now I really am an old hippie. But it was so foreign to people to think about that they couldn't wrap their minds around it. And so I used to get all these phone calls all the time from people who wanted to come to my house and see what's it look like. And it looks like every other house, but they were amazed because people just didn't have a concept of, what would it look like to live differently, to have a different kind of energy system. But over these last 14 years, what I've seen is this growing movement of just ordinary, everyday folks that are seeing that there is another way that's actually possible. And so that grassroots movement has, I think, started to grow into policy areas. We probably shouldn't talk politics after an election last night, but just the fact that, in this election that we had 3 Green Party members elected, I think is really an indication of people looking for more systemic kind of change in policy.
So Dale, maybe we'll riff off that and go to you. So what do you think is the role of politics in the democratic process in this kind of systemic change?
I'm about the last person you want to ask that question to. Those who know me well know me. I err on the side of cynicism, especially with respect to politics. I've been a political junkie as long as I've been able to vote, and it gets a little frustrating at times because there's such an ebb and flow towards what seems to be or ought to be a linear progression can ebb and flow so often. We're seeing that right now, in particular with respect to the national, could you call it a consensus that existed a few years ago amongst the provincial governments related to carbon pricing. When Justin Trudeau's government was elected, seemingly, there was this great support in Ontario with 40% of the Canadian population. I think by the time Trudeau announced the carbon pricing mandate, something like 84% of the Canadian population was already living under some form of carbon price, or was within a province that had announced they were bringing their own in voluntarily. And that's significant. That's a big deal. But of course now we've had a couple setbacks on that file, and we see a more of a coalition of could we call them recalcitrant politicians? How's that? I like using that word when I can. Who really want to move that back. So what is the role of policy? Right now, it certainly seems to be a little more, not necessarily a constructive role that it's playing, but it's absolutely necessary. I mean, one of the best examples of how policy can really move the needle on these things is what happened in Germany through the early 2000s when they put in place a feed-in tariff for renewable energy, from solar especially. And because for those, I imagine most of the room's familiar with what a feed-in tariff is, but for those of you who aren't, basically the German government said that if you can put electricity from a solar panel onto the grid, we'll guarantee you a really high price for 20 years. And what that did was it drove a lot of private investment from individuals to go out and buy solar panels, put it on their roof, and get that contract for 20 years. Because there was such a scale of demand from Germany for solar panels, it caught the attention of Chinese manufacturers. And we know the Chinese can do things at a scale that is, at economies of scale that we often just dream about in the rest of the world. And those Chinese manufacturers started a process that saw the per watt cost of electricity from solar panels to now come down below the cost of coal. Where we're at today, because of those investments in economies of scale and economies of manufacturing, solar energy, you don't have to be an old hippie to be living off the grid. We have some young hippies in our group that live off the grid too. And one of my good friends, Damon Hardy, the executive director at Community Forest International, I remember him telling me that, and Damon, I'll get these numbers wrong, but you guys basically spent something like $5,000 to get a 300-watt system installed on their house. 5 years later, which is like 3 years ago, they tripled the size of the system for the same price, right? And we're seeing that happen around the world now, to the point that Trump is not going to be able to stop solar energy from becoming the least expensive form of energy anywhere, period, electricity, period. So what can policy do? It can be incredibly powerful. It can also reinforce my most cynical tendencies.
So what's the trade-off there between the systemic policy level change or systemic level change and then Damon putting a solar panel on his roof? Like, Wendy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Is there a trade-off there? Should people be directing their energies to one or the other, or do we need both?
Oh, absolutely need both. And again, it's a movement that Dale's talked about that's growing. There's not going to be a choice in the matter anymore. And in terms of trade-offs, we've got an economy that's built on fossil fuels, and it's trillions of dollars. There's a lot of resistance, to a segment. It creates a lot of jobs. And I think part of it is getting the message out. And people really don't understand when we talk about, moving to a system of renewable energy, we're actually talking about creating far more jobs than on a fossil fuel basis. But, the resistance is huge. So at some point, I think we need to be able to come together better. There was somebody said something yesterday about, collaborating with the enemy. And that's a negative connotation, but we are so polarized in the discussion right now. It's either or. And it's really time to move to, a new way of looking at how do we transition. And so there needs to be some real political leadership around that. Because people have a certain amount of power, but the power ends at the decision-making table. Yeah.
If I could just pick up on that same line of thinking, one of the big challenges I find that I encounter when I have conversations with people who don't necessarily live in the environmental bubble that I know I live in, is exactly that trade-off question, right? And that has been a failure of our side, for lack of a better term, not properly or communicating the wrong narrative. And this idea that there has to be a trade-off between the economy and the environment, that there necessarily need be a trade-off between quality of life and saving the planet. And that is a narrative that is very well entrenched, is accepted, and is wrong. And we will never, if we're talking about mobilizing a global and a ubiquitous movement transition towards a more towards a climate secure future, we're never going to get the rest of the population on side if we're only having this conversation about trade-offs. Because at the end of the day, and it's difficult to accept, but I think I fully accept it now, I think we will cook this planet if people believe that they need to do with less to save the planet, to avoid climate change. If people feel that they need to, I mean, the best example is what's going on in India, for example. There's about 400 million people that don't have access to electricity, right? These are people who are living in the $1 to $2 per day range type poverty. These people need access to more energy. These people need access, and they deserve access, and it is just that they gain access to more energy and a higher standard of life and better health care and all of these things. It is not reasonable to say that you need to do without just to save the planet. If countries like India need to choose between electrifying via coal or not electrifying at all, they will electrify via coal and we will cook this planet. And it doesn't even need to be that extreme. I think it is the same as with people in our own country with respect to consumption. And so at a talk earlier today, to bring Damon up again, Damon gave a talk about the ecosystem collective that we at Community Forest International have created as a sort of a chamber of commerce to fight climate change. And one of the key tenets to that is how we decouple economic growth and growth in emissions and needing to separate those two. And there is a narrative there that is a more attractive narrative to the rest of society, a narrative that is based on abundance rather than lack of abundance, and that tells the story of, like solar energy being so cheap. Zero marginal cost. We're moving towards a future where we'll have zero marginal cost for additional electricity because electricity is going to be so cheap and ubiquitous and everyone will have it. That's the story we need to tell. An ecological future is a more abundant future, not a less abundant future.
So why aren't we telling that story, or why is it hard to get, or maybe we're just bad at it, to get that story out there?
I mean, I think we've been pigeonholed to a certain extent. One of my, I don't know if I'm correct with this or not, but one of my perceptions is that there is a very well-funded and well-organized camp that we are in direct opposition to. And they tend to speak with a single voice and with very clear and consistent narratives that get drilled into the population. Whereas on our side, we have more decentralized power structures, perhaps, and they're rather than there being a single institute or a single funder that is spreading dark money out through all these foundations to coordinate a message, we're just less coordinated, and so we've allowed ourselves to be pigeonholed to a great extent. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or if you maybe just think about the lunch.
No, I agree completely, and I think the other thing is that the environmental movement, the renewable energy movement, is really quite young compared to the fossil fuel movement, and so getting that message out against such resistance. Again, there's there's a lot at stake for people that are vested in fossil fuels. And they're not going to let go easily. And so to try to get that message out to folks against that resistance, and I just want to follow up on what Dale was talking about in terms of abundance and not having to give up something. That was kind of the point I was making, where people wanted to come to my house to see, you know, what's it look like. And what they expected, you know, they were like, well, you know, do you have heat? You know, do you have a television? And they're totally amazed when they find out, you know, I have this little tiny system. And one of the messages that I try to send to people, I deliberately have a very small system. And it's because I can live on that quite well. And people tell me all the time, there's no way you can live on that size system. I don't know. I've been doing it for 14 years, but...
You're still alive, I think.
I'm still alive. And, you know, I have all of the same...
Yeah, she is.
I have all of the same things that everybody else has. But on top of that, I have no white noise. I have no ambient light shining in my face. I'm completely in touch with nature. And, you know, I get up every day and I look around me and I just go, this is so abundant. You know, but when the message out there is you have to give up something, you can't have kids that can play, you know, on their computers, and, you know, you can't have a hairdryer. That's a common one. I don't know where the hairdryer thing came up with, but there's actually, interestingly, more women. We have a Facebook page that we set up just to try to feed information out. When I went off the grid 14 years ago, there was really no information out there. And it was having to figure it all out on my own, and I made a ton of mistakes doing it. So I said, well, I'd love to share my mistakes with other people, so that we started this off-grid Facebook page. And it has just grown like crazy, people that are off-grid or going off-grid, and a lot of it, interestingly enough, are women, almost more so than men. And one of the first questions they ask is, can I have an hairdryer? You know? Yeah, ladies, you can have a hairdryer, I promise.
So other than the hairdryer, Wendy, what gives you hope for the future?
You know, it's just so exciting to be a part of this. Like I say, to watch even that little Facebook page grow, and the excitement and the people sharing information, and seeing it become mainstream, and not just, you know, it used to be CBC always came to me every time, you know, it was always the first snowstorm and all the power went out. I'd get a phone call from CBC. They want to do a story about living off grid. Because I was kind of like the only one around. Or at least one that would openly speak about it. Now I can send them off to all kinds of people, and you know, and they're doing things and showing that this is just a really viable way to live, and you don't have to give up anything. Yeah.
How about you, Dale? What gives you the hope for the future?
I mean, it's. I think there's a bit of a realization going on, and I mean, you asked the question earlier about scale. You know, between individual action and large-scale action, and if I could just focus on the larger scale for a second, or orders of magnitude for a second, there's a realization that we need to provide a better value proposition to if we're going to get people to switch consumption patterns. We need to offer people more than just the moral and ethical win. A really great example of that is I mentioned solar panels becoming so inexpensive, but Tesla has been an incredible example now, where, you know, they focus on just building a better car. Happen to be electric, you know, it can be completely emissions free, but they just built a far superior vehicle. Performance, the power that those vehicles have, and now they're getting to the price point. They, in January of this year, they delivered 1,800 cars. In August, they delivered 18,000 in the US alone, all right? grew by, and that wasn't just a blip, that was a curve that led up to that point, consistent growth. And so because they were able, they did that because they were able to just, straight up provide a stronger and better value proposition to the consumers of their cars. And oh wait, by the way, it just happens to be that with this technology we can reduce emissions by 20% globally. And we're starting to see those growth curves and adoption of those technologies go linear. Same with solar panels and wind farms. The cost of battery technology is falling precipitously. Understanding that we have this incredible unutilized carbon vacuum known as our forests, that we can, once we figure out that these things are incredible at pulling carbon out of the air, we'll actually get down to it. Those two things are really what helped me get out of bed in the morning.
Great. Okay, well, I want to thank you both. This has been really, I think, inspiring and gives us all hope for the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks.